The following is a Rogers Community Television special presentation.
In July of 1955, both the Mercury and the City of London hit 100. In the middle of a sweltering heat wave, Londoners came out to welcome band leader Guy Lombardo for a special homecoming concert. Dundas Street was clogged for hours with a mammoth centennial parade. The Western Fair Grandstand hosted the year's Miss Canada pageant, and local singer Priscilla Wright appeared on that weekend's Ed Sullivan Show. Birthday celebrations didn't come any bigger.
This is the kind of a theater, too, and like most of the old theaters of the old days in London, it hasn't got any air conditioning.
But the real news that summer was 44-year-old writer Orlo Miller. His historical romance, This Was London, played to sold-out crowds at the Grand Theatre. It was an ideal chance for the popular historian to combine his twin loves of heritage and creative writing. In Miller's hands, the story of his hometown of London could be a tragedy, a comedy, or a triumph. But it never could be dull.
I beg, sir, to state these ideas. They lead to the propriety of establishing a capital of Upper Canada, which may be somewhat distant from the center of the present colony. This capital I propose to be established at New London. John Graves Simcoe, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada.
The whole idea of London begins with John Graves Simcoe. John Graves Simcoe was a military man. He was a hero during the American Revolutionary War. He was also extremely wealthy. He achieved great wealth when he married his wife Elizabeth, who today is known as a famous landscape painter. And he was a man who probably could have lived happily on his estate with his many children for the rest of his life. But he was a man who wanted a lot more.
What Simcoe wanted was a capital for the new colony of Upper Canada. British officials, fearing raids from the rebellious United States, were eager to move their legislature away from the border. Simcoe went to extremes and chose a site miles away from the nearest settlement. The only likely transportation route was a nearby river that early French explorers had aptly christened the Ditch. Despite the area's shortcomings, the lieutenant governor was determined to make his vision a reality. Elizabeth Simcoe even sketched a plan for her husband's capital, complete with a villa for herself. The trouble was, neither John Graves Simcoe nor the British government had any right to the land.
If you go out into the woods, let's say, you know, and you stand there and stand very quiet, and you listen to the sounds of the woods. You know, you can hear the wind through the trees. You can hear the birds in the distance. You can hear the small creatures underfoot. Can you own that? European man, Western man talks about ownership and fee simple title. A piece of paper will give you title. It's not the same concept in the Aboriginal world.
At least 3 different tribes lived in Western Ontario at the time of Simcoe's visit, and generations of natives had occupied the land for thousands of years before that. Some establishing settlements, others migrating with the seasons. Although Simcoe was considered a sympathetic British officer, he was determined to secure the property for his capital. Ultimately, his vision of London would have a contentious land treaty as its foundation.
And peoples of the Chippewa Nation of Indians, being desirous for a certain consideration hereafter shown of selling and disposing of a certain parcel or tract of land lying on and near to the river unto His Britannic Majesty, King George III, our great father. For and in consideration of the sum of 800 pounds Quebec currency value.
Now,
in
those are the words that are
estimates,
reflected on the
according to the
treaty.
Montreal price,
Sell,
now
alienate,
delivered to
bargain.
the receipt whereof.
Those are real estate terms that are not translatable in some cases into modern Ojibwe. So when you look at the words on the treaty itself, it says for the Township of London, in the year 1796, 132,000 acres of land is sold to the British Crown by the Chippewa Nation of Indians. Now, if those words aren't translatable into Chippewa or Ojibwe, therefore the people at the time could not have been selling the land. They'd be talking in terms of sharing and opening up the borders to welcome people to land.
The stripping of Aboriginal culture began before the treaty was signed. Simcoe rejected the natives' title for the river, Askunasipi, and named it after the Thames of his native England. After toying with the name Georgiana for his new capital, he opted for New London. For better or worse, the settlement would exist in a British orbit for nearly 2 centuries. But London's founder would leave only one permanent reminder of his visit. Simcoe ordered his troops to cut a trail from Burlington Bay to the Thames River. As the area's first road, it would be named after his friend Henry Dundas, a British cabinet minister who frequently smoothed out arguments between Simcoe and Lord Dorchester.
John Gray Simcoe and Guy Carleton, later Lord Dorchester, were an interesting contrast in personalities. John Gray Simcoe was 41 in 1793, an ambitious man, a man on the make. Guy Carleton was in his late 60s, very reserved, and quite frankly couldn't stand Simcoe. The two men argued frequently, and eventually what happened was that Simcoe was told by Dorchester, "Your plans for London are crazy. I'm not going to support them. Set up your capital in York and forget about the forks of the Thames."
Dejected, the lieutenant governor and his family retired to the chosen capital, a former trading post native bands called Toronto. Simcoe would spend a miserable winter on the shores of Lake Ontario, brooding about his failed dream. When he died 13 years later, London would still be a wilderness. During the War of 1812, several large estates along the coast of Lake Erie were ransacked by invading American troops. But it was rumored that the vandalism to one property was done by vengeful locals against the man who controlled settlement in the area. His name was Thomas Talbot. No person had a more controversial role in the development of southwestern Ontario than Colonel Thomas Talbot. Praised as a great man of history in popular plays and films, he was also scorned as an ogre by historians. However, London wouldn't have existed without him.
All kinds of stuff came this way far before other areas, and it's only because Talbot made sure that before you got any kind of land grant, you would have to occupy that land, you would have to build a structure, you would have to consistently live there and do something with it. And whereas other areas were, snapped up by speculators, sort of absentee speculators, who did diddly with their acquisitions.
Talbot succeeded in spite of himself. He had always seen himself as the baron of a Western Ontario colony. But the vision never worked out. Most settlers refused to take the claim seriously. Talbot's blunt personality didn't help matters.
The colonel told us that a few days before, a tall Yankee came and looked in at his window. "What do you want?" asked the colonel sharply. "I've been 4 days in Talbot settlement," answered the stranger, "and I wish to see its founder." "Well, you have seen him," said the colonel. "Now go away." Sir James E. Alexander.
What drove such a mean and crotchety guy to come over here and give all that energy to the development of this new land? And there is a rumor, it's never been confirmed, that he was spurned by some woman. and had to put an ocean between himself and his torment. He'd come over here once before with Simcoe and thought, ah, sod it. Life's just a crock anyway. I'll go over to the new land and give the settlers a rough time, and in that way make my mark, perhaps. So I like to think that we benefited from the heartbreak of Thomas Talbot.
But there was no doubt Talbot's settlement plan worked. In the 20 years following his arrival in 1803, the population of southern Ontario grew from a handful of fur trappers to over 40,000 landowners in nearly 30 newly created townships. Even the area around the forks of the Thames River was attracting scattered settlement. And then, an act of fate helped speed up the process. On the night of November 14, 1825, a fire log fell out of its grate at the district courthouse near the shores of Lake Erie. The resulting blaze badly damaged the building, giving officials an excuse to relocate the district capital to a more populated area to the northwest. St. Thomas and Delaware were considered and then rejected when speculators jacked up real estate prices. Officials eventually chose the area around London, on land Simcoe had secured for the British government. Construction began on the London District Courthouse, modelled after Talbot's ancestral castle in Ireland. It was the only part of his feudal dream that was realized. It was during this time that London earned its first original title, the City in the Forest, later shortened to the Fourth City. Former surveyor Peter McGregor, a chain bearer on a surveying party, became one of London's first residents, tavern keepers, and business failures. By 1832, the village of London enjoyed a population of 300 and all the luxuries of pioneer life: general stores, a newspaper, and a growing number of churches, including St. Paul's, the center of economic and social power in the community, and one of the flashpoints of a rebellion. John Harris had moved to London's Eldon House in 1834. As a supporter of the Tory government, British officials hoped the arrival of the new district treasurer would calm any uprisings by reformers bent on introducing American-style democracy. As a member of the establishment, Harris didn't have much luck. The community's first election degenerated into a riot. A year later, rebel forces began to mass in the townships around London. There were threats that Harris, as an agent of the king, would be killed and his home burned. For Harris's wife, Amelia, it was a nightmare revisited. As a young girl, she had witnessed American troops torch her father's home.
There was quite a lot of activity in this area during the rebellion, and John Harris, of course, being a firm supporter of the government that was in place, was against the rebels. There's a wonderful story told of Amelia in the basement making bullets so they could defend themselves if they were attacked.
But the rebellion never amounted to much. Most of the uprisings were badly planned and easily put down by the local militia. Dr. Charles Duncombe, who was responsible for the area's uprising, fled to the States disguised as a woman. Many of his supporters were arrested and held in the London courthouse to await trial and sentencing.
January 27th, 1839. Dear wife, I am at this moment confined in the cell from which I am to go to the scaffold. I received my sentence today and am to be executed on February 6th. I am permitted to see you tomorrow, any time after 10 o'clock in the morning, as may suit you best. I wish you would think of such questions as you wish to ask me, as I do not know how long you will be permitted to stay. Think as little of my unhappy fate as you can. As from the love you bear me, I know too well how it must affect you. I must say goodbye for the night, and may God protect you and my dear child, and give you fortitude to meet that coming event. That this may be the case is the prayer of your affectionate husband, Joshua G. Doane.
Doane's death sentence was carried out 10 days later.
In the trials that followed, there were 18 people from the area sentenced to death, and 6 of those executions were carried out The effect of that on the populace was such that they were afraid of another uprising. People were so fed up with the executions by the end of the 6th day that the other 12 people condemned to death had their sentences commuted and were shipped off to Australia.
Officials were also fed up with the political unease in London. In May of 1838, British regiments were stationed in the area. They brought order and economic prosperity to the community. Once again, fate had come to aid of Simcoe's vision.
The garrison was paying in cash, and before this, most of what was done was the barter system. And so with cash, people had money to buy things that they wouldn't have before, and they'd get a better price for their goods and what they would purchase. And it was just tremendous, a number of things that the garrison needed, whether it be accommodation being built for them, or leather goods, straw, hay, food products, and so on like that. So the population must have developed, went 2 or 3 times over in that short time.
No one was happier with London's new prosperity than John Harris, whose home was transformed into the social center of the community. Over the next 2 decades, Eldon House hosted everyone, from officers of the garrison to a future British Prime Minister.
John Harris welcomed the garrison with open arms. Eldon House was immediately known as a place where an officer could receive a meal, a pleasant social evening, and even more than that, John Harris had 7 daughters.
Common soldiers never enjoyed tea and card games at Eldon House, but their voracious thirst for English stock ale and female companionship created other diversions in London. Over the next few years, entrepreneurs and vagabonds of both sexes set up a string of taverns and brothels along Richmond Street. More respectable business operators followed. John Labatt and Thomas Carling sold their farms and moved into town so they could start up breweries. John McClary established a stove company that would be renowned across Canada. And the future of E.W. Hyman's tannery was assured when it landed a lucrative contract to provide harnesses and boots for the garrison. Although these early businesses flourished, their growth was hampered by an inability to export their products. Stagecoaches could only creep along area dirt and wood plank roads. It took most of a day just to travel to St. Thomas. If London was to evolve into a major Canadian city, it needed a better set of wheels. On December 15, 1853, they arrived.
The impact it had on local businesses would be just tremendous, because now you can move things more quickly, in greater quantity. There'd be less breakage. The price of things would have dropped as far as the transportation costs over what it had been using rail or using roads before. And the impact it would have, economic impact it would have on society, there probably has been nothing, no single other technological innovation that has been so great in the last 200 years as the advent of the railways.
Although it took the first train 6 hours to arrive from Hamilton, the modern transportation age had come to London. Within 5 years, the line would be linked to Windsor, Toronto, and Montreal. London, a wilderness 30 years earlier, would become a bigger city than Detroit or Chicago. City officials were so grateful to the railway, they adopted it as part of London's coat of arms.
Colonel Talbot passed a very bad night and is worse today. Yesterday he would not take any medicine, and today he is afraid he will die. Poor old man, he is very miserable. Charlotte Harris.
Although he had attended the original groundbreaking of the railroad, Thomas Talbot would never live to see its completion or the prosperity it would bring. He died in February of 1853, almost 50 years to the day he had started to settle southwestern Ontario.
As long as you had that man alive, he was a figure, and by the 1850s he represented the settlement, the pioneer period. That period was over in 1853 in December when the Great Western arrived. The pioneer settlement of, well, most of Ontario was over in the 1850s. And so I think died at a convenient time for us to write the end to that chapter and begin the next phase, the building up of the province.
July 1st, 1867. This is Dominion Day, the first day of Confederation. There has been a review today of the military and volunteers. Most of the people have celebrated the day by going on excursions, as it is a public holiday. Sophia went to the Merediths to play a match at croquet. Bella returned with her to play euchre. George returned from Windsor late in the evening with a very severely burned hand, which he received while letting off rockets. Amelia Harris.
1867, Canada becomes a nation. The Harrises watch it all happen, but there is no one in the family who actually took part in what happened. Amelia, the matriarch of the family, in her diary still expresses the fact that Eldon House and the Harris family are very prominent citizens of London, but they really no longer take any active part in the affairs of the city.
Amelia Harris would outlive both the husband and the British garrison that had once made her house the social hub of London. John Harris had died in 1850. The 53rd Regiment would leave the city in 1869. At the time of Amelia's death 14 years later, Eldon House and its glory years would be forgotten by most Londoners. The regiment's old parade grounds were landscaped into Victoria Park. The green space also housed a makeshift ball diamond for the London Tecumsehs, until complaints about the fences prompted the construction of Tecumseh Park at the forks of the river in 1877. The new diamond's first season was its best when the Tecumsehs beat the Pittsburgh Alleghenies for the International Association pennant, the forerunner of the World Series. It was to be the first Major League championship to be won by a Canadian team on Canadian soil, and the last until the Toronto Blue Jays reclaimed the title in 1993. London was evolving into a major city in other ways. St. Peter's Basilica, London's most magnificent Catholic church, was completed in 1885. Bishop John Walsh had promoted its expensive construction to prevent French influences from moving the seat of the diocese to Windsor. Thomas Talbot's old courthouse was remodeled just in time for the notorious trial of a group of Lucan area vigilantes accused of murdering members of the Donnelly family. To the east of the city was an industrial heart of railway shops and petrochemical manufacturers. Fumes from kerosene refineries were said to be so strong that they stripped the paint off nearby houses. The London Asylum on Oxford Street established new standards of care for the mentally challenged under the guidance of Dr. Richard Buck. To the west of the river was the village of Petersville, where low property taxes attracted the city's working class. Most of the community was built on floodplain, a drawback that struck home in July of 1883 when the Thames washed out the area, drowning 17 people. Earlier that year, Paul Peel returned home. The 22-year-old artist had fared well in Paris, earning a spot in that year's Spring Salon. However, he still had one great artistic vision to share with his fellow Londoners.
And it is a brilliant demonstration of how adept he was and how much he had learned, because he painted light in that particular work exquisitely. And the composition is really quite extraordinary. So we have a very beautiful painting of a hot, dry July day, clouds perhaps promising rain, and there was our first major marketplace.
The Covent Garden Market would be Peel's most famous painting of London, and the last. He returned to Europe later that year, where his work soon attracted a large following. At the time of his death, at the age of 32, Peel would be the most celebrated Londoner in the world, and one of the finest Canadian artists of the 19th century. His fame would even outlive the old market building. Future growth for all of London was assured when a new water supply was secured at the freshwater springs near Byron. The construction of the new pump house and reservoir led to the creation of Springbank Park, London's most popular picnic ground of its time. 2 riverboat companies were set up to ferry in Londoners from the downtown area. Many of the vessels suffered from makeshift construction and lax safety standards. Of the 6 boats that operated on the Thames, the worst was the Victoria. On May 24, 1881, Queen Victoria celebrated her 62nd birthday. The event offered Londoners a rare holiday from their 6-day work weeks. Many had decided to take the 15-cent boat ride to Springbank Park, and the ferry operators were eager for the extra business. By the time the Victoria arrived for the afternoon's last return trip, the dock was packed.
The people were in a panic and a hurry to get home. The domestics wanted to get home and get the meals cooking. Kids were cranky. And as sometimes happens, people get foolish in large crowds and they don't think. And people crowded on the ship very, very viciously almost. And it was overloaded in a matter of minutes. The people just streamed past the 2 pursers trying to take the tickets.
The Victoria was designed to carry 400 passengers. By the time it pulled out from the Springbank Pavilion at 5 o'clock, it carried 650.
About 5:30, we were coming very slow by Griffith's Dam. As I looked down the staircase, I noticed the water ankle deep down below. The crowd seemed excited and kept rushing from one side to the other. Captain Rankin told them repeatedly to stand still and not crowd so much. James Drennan.
In a frantic attempt to save the boat, Rankin decided to beach the Victoria on a nearby sandbar. He had barely given the order when 2 members of the London Rowing Club, unaware of the Victoria's peril, decided to race it down the Thames. It was the final ingredient for disaster.
People rushed all over to the right-hand side of the ship to take a look, but the crowd was just too big. The balance was far too off, and the ship heeled over tremendously. People realized what was going to happen very quickly, and a lot of them tried to back away from the railing and push to the other side of the ship to counterbalance it. But far too many, and balanced way too far, and the ship heeled over to the other side, and at that point, the boiler rolled off its mount.
As it toppled overboard, the boiler took out the main supports for the top deck, which collapsed on the passengers below. In a matter of seconds, the structure of the Victoria had disintegrated in 17 feet of water.
I was standing on the north side of the upper deck when the crash came. I was hurled into the water with 500 others. I sank to the bottom, but managed to climb up on the people, but in turn was climbed up on by others. I then exerted myself for a final struggle and got on top again and reached the shore. The screams which arose from the drowning mass were terrific. William Soper.
As we write, at 3 o'clock in the morning, some 200 bodies have been removed, and it is believed a great many more are yet in the water. The catastrophe is one that can scarcely be appreciated in all its magnitude. But if the roofs of all the houses in London could be raised today, the scenes of woe would make the strongest man weep. The London Free Press.
May 26th. The shops have been closed and the city is to wear a badge of mourning for a month. Coffins could not be got in London sufficiently for the dead, and they have been telegraphed for to Toronto, Hamilton, and other places. Funeral processions have not been out of sight from early morning until dark. It is a dreadful calamity. Amelia Harris.
The total death count was 230. It was London's worst tragedy, and no one ever served a single day in jail for it.
The captain blamed the people, the owner of the ship blamed the people, the pursers blamed just about everybody else, the people blamed the owners of the ship and the company line. Everybody blamed everybody else without realizing they all caused it.
Although electricity had been available in London since the 1880s, it was provided by coal-burning generators. The resulting power was expensive, and its creation polluted the air. While hydro generated at Niagara Falls was cheaper and cleaner, entrepreneurs refused to invest in power lines across the province. If Ontario was to prosper in an electrified age, it would need public-owned utilities. It also needed a man willing to fight for that vision.
I have no friends. I have had to fight tenaciously every inch of the way for hydro, so that fighting has become my second nature, and I fight with my friends needlessly and lose them. Sir Adam Beck.
The son of a German immigrant, Adam Beck had successfully integrated himself into London's establishment by 1903. He had lost his accent, become an Anglican, and had served as the city's mayor. As a business owner, he also resented the high cost of private electricity. At the age of 46, he was ready to take on the biggest challenge of his career by wresting the control of hydro from independent power companies.
One by one, this guy had to crawl over the backs of some very powerful people. If you want a parallel, it's sort of like trying to humble the Bank of Montreal in modern parlance.
As a member of the provincial government, Beck would be ruthless in getting his way. As the self-styled Minister of Power, he made Ontario's Hydro Commission his kingdom and steamrollered anything that stood in his way.
When he made up his mind that he wanted something done, it was done. Premier Whitney had said that a certain thing could not be done due to the existing law. Beck told Whitney to see that the law was changed at once. E.V. Buchanan.
On November 30th, 1910, London became the second city in Ontario to receive hydro, generated at one of 3 new plants on the Niagara River. London housewives could now enjoy the luxuries of electric stoves, refrigeration, and hot running water. Kellogg's and Labatt's became the first 2 London businesses to adopt electrical motors for production. When these innovations failed to use up the glut of cheap electricity, Beck simply created new needs.
Adam Beck came up with this grand idea of running a series of electric railways across Ontario. And he thought, well, I've got to have a prototype. I've got to have a railway that I can show how good this can be. I'm going to build it at very high-tech specifications. And right in his own backyard, of course, was the London and Port Stanley Railway. And Beck went to London City Council and said, for $800,000, we can begin the process of upgrading this railway and electrifying it. And of course, when he neglected to mention that it was going to take an additional $500,000 or $600,000 to complete the job.
But to the small business owner and the rural farmer, Adam Beck was a hero. Some political insiders encouraged Beck to form a hydro party and run for premier.
One winter evening, coming from Toronto on the train, Sir Adam Beck said, "Look out there, the lights in the farms. That's what I've been fighting for." E.V. Buchanan.
Ambrose J. Small began his career as a bartender in his father's hotel, which was next door to the Grand Opera House in Toronto. He was bitten by the theater bug quite early and eventually became owner and manager of the Grand, as well as of a group of 12 other theaters throughout Canada. This theater, the Grand Opera House, London, was the queen of his chain. When he built it in 1901, it had the largest stage in North America. On December the 2nd, 1919, Ambrose Small sold all his theatrical properties, including this house, to a Montreal syndicate for $2 million. On the afternoon of that day, his wife deposited a certified check for $1 million as down payment on the deal. At 5:30 that evening, Small left his office on Yonge Street in Toronto and walked out onto the street and vanished. From that day to this, no one has seen Ambrose J. Small with one exception, his murderer. That he was murdered, there can be no reasonable doubt. But where, by whom, and what was done with his body are still unanswered questions. There's a persistent rumor, which has been going the rounds for years, that Ambrose J. Small's body was actually buried someplace in this building, and that his ghost walks the theater at night.
It was very late, I don't know, 1:32 in the morning. The night watchman didn't like this. He didn't like me to be in the theater by myself. And I was working at something on my desk, and I heard Bill come down the hall, as he often did, and stop at my door. And I lifted my head to say, "Bill, I thought I told you to go home," and there was no one there. And I got a very odd feeling up the back of my neck. I thought, that's bizarre. I could have sworn that there was somebody standing in the doorway. Indeed, I heard the footsteps, but even looking up, you can tell when there's a presence there and when there isn't. And I thought, even as I was looking into nothing, that there was someone standing there. And I thought, well, that's foolish, don't be silly.
Well, it'd be after the opening performance of one of these plays that I was in as a young teenager, and a friend and I went back on stage, and the house lights were out, but there was a stage light that was on. So it was dark, but not completely black or anything like that. And as we were standing there, not too far from the trap door that was on the stage, I noticed off to my right, which would be stage left, something that appeared to be climbing the ladder up to the catwalk. And it continued up, and then it walked across the catwalk to the other side of the stage, and then out of my view at that point. And it really wasn't until the next day that I got talking with Audrey Lewis, who was the director, that she explained, well, you must have seen the ghost of Ambrose Small.
And I used to work late in the theater, on the books or something, and I've been there 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. When Dandy or Blackstone appeared there, after hours, went backstage and looked over all this equipment, they used to have, cutting girls in half and making things disappear and all this stuff and so on. And I looked through all this stuff, and I was there for lots of time. I never heard of Ambrose Small. He didn't sing to me or anything else, so where he was at that time, I don't know. The ghost of Ambrose Small is a lot of malarkey.
In 1924, a group of local musicians, led by 3 high school dropouts, boarded the ferry at Port Stanley. Having gone as far as they could in London, they were ready to try their luck across the lake in Cleveland. Shortly after their arrival, an American booking agent would christen the group Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians.
All the local musicians at that time, they were all saying, fall flat in his face. And my dad would say, no, they're going to make it.
5 difficult years would pass before Lombardo would establish himself as the most famous Londoner of all time. In the meantime, there was no shortage of celebrities in the Forest City. In 1923, Frederick Banting shared a Nobel Prize for the discovery of hormone insulin. He had done the groundwork for the diabetes treatment while teaching at Western's Medical School. At the University Thespian Society, 20-year-old Alexander Knox thrilled audiences as Hamlet. The former Strathroy native would take up an acting career that would lead to an Oscar-nominated performance. 4 months after Charles Lindbergh's flight over the Atlantic Ocean, Captain Terry Tully and Lieutenant James Metcalf tried to be the first to fly from London, Ontario to London, England. The media-fueled stunt ended in tragedy when the 2 pilots were lost in a storm off of Newfoundland. Worn out by battles over hydro and devastated by the loss of his wife, Sir Adam Beck checked into Baltimore's Johns Hopkins Hospital in early 1925. He returned home that spring. "I am finished," he told his staff. He died at his North London estate on August 15th of pernicious anemia. 1 year later, scientists discovered a cure.
The funeral was a massive event. Of course, here was Beck, the revered politician, the revered mayor of London, the founder of public power. And precisely at noon hour, all power in the city was shut down in a moment of silence in honor of Adam Beck.
At the service, London's mayor, who had once refused to bow in Beck's presence, scandalized himself by dressing down in tan shoes and a straw hat.
They went nuts, wild. And all that he said to them, it was his hat, it was paid for, and it fit him. And every election that came up for years, whether Daddy won or lost the election. Where's your straw hat, George? Because Daddy loved it when everybody called him George.
Born in Detroit, George Wenig first arrived in London as a trick bicycle rider at the turn of the century. He stayed on to found the area's largest bicycle dealership, boasting he was the man who made walking expensive.
George Wenig, and I can't tell you what year this was, rode a bicycle from London to Halifax and back again. Now, that was quite a stunt because in those days there were no paved roads. And George Wenig had to pedal a bicycle on a gravel road for about 1,500 or 1,800 miles from London to Halifax and back again. Now when I say back again, I'm not really positive about that. He had to get back here some way because I saw him in London.
There was no good or bad advertising for George Wenig, just advertising. He taught his 2-year-old son to ride a bike and then forced the child to pose for publicity photos. As a stunt, he once ordered a contractor to build his new store in a record 30 days. To make sure the deadline was met, he hired a brass band to motivate the construction workers.
He always said, I don't care what you do, say about me, as long as you say something. And quite often he wasn't impressed with what I did because it was a slam on this or a slam on that. And I spent a lot of time doing local cartoons when he was mayor, and his color was a factor, I think.
First elected mayor for 1923, Wenig brought his populist vision to the public office. He claimed to have views on every subject and never hesitated to express them. When the London Street Railway fell into debt, he stunned council by recommending the city found a rival bus system at a staggering cost of $8 million. He once campaigned on the promise to re-establish civic bingo games, forgetting that they were illegal. When elected, he instituted them anyway.
The newspaper had painted George Wenig as a rather nasty, uneducated, uncooperative person, but I found that his main interest was in doing things for the public of London, and that he was more interested in the underdog than he was in anything else.
Common men and women always had the final say on Wenig, whether he was breaking up a Port Stanley bootlegging operation or introducing citywide garbage collection. Out of 18 runs for the mayor's office, George Wenig would be elected 9 times. No London politician has ever come close to matching his stamina at campaigning. The 1929 edition of the Western Fair featured California Frank's Rodeo and the Les Eldon Acrobats. Labor Minister Peter Heenan, who opened the festivities under perfect skies, told Londoners that Canada had reached the point where it could develop without the fear of unemployment. The next month, the stock market crashed. London investors alone lost $10 million. Guy Lombardo, who had just opened at New York's Roosevelt Grill, saw his portfolio drop by $60,000 in a single day. An overextended North American economy was collapsing. The effect on London was instantaneous. 1929 graduates found it hard to find jobs. By April of 1930, the number of help-wanted ads in the Free Press was off by more than 40%. Businesses that had been part of the city for generations closed forever. Carling Breweries transferred its operations to Toronto. The London Advertiser, the city's liberal newspaper, shut its doors. Openings at London's remaining industries were at a premium.
There was a period in the Depression when I think things were very tough for my father financially. I know he made gloves. He made leather gloves for sale, which is not exactly his job. And my mother sold artificial flowers, which is not exactly her job.
Government projects like the Dominion Public Building did offer workers a temporary refuge from the Depression. But by March of 1933, the city was forced to cut single men off relief, forcing them to turn to soup kitchens and private welfare agencies. Others were sent off to work camps or told to shovel snow from area roads. In April of 1937, the city hit bottom when the Thames River flooded, leaving over 5,000 Londoners homeless. Not even a radio address from the tireless George Wenig could cheer people up.
We always remember the way he said to the citizenry, keep calm, keep calm. And I haven't heard that kind of rural pronunciation since John Diefenbaker.
But for people lucky enough to have a job and money, the 1930s were a good time. Members of London's Hunt Club still enjoyed golf on the university grounds or their annual Thanksgiving Day fox hunt. In the era of the gentleman's sports star, no one represented the well-to-do better than Sandy Somerville. The son of a London box manufacturer, Somerville excelled at football, cricket, and hockey. But golf became his first love. In September of 1932, Somerville surprised the experts by making it to the finals of the U.S. Amateur in Baltimore. In the 36-hole championship round, Silent Sandy played the golf match of his life against Johnny Goodman of Nebraska.
He beat Goodman 2-1, and he said that was the end of a very satisfactory day. It's in the middle of the Depression, and here's a local hero that sort of revived the community to some degree. Mayor Hayman presented Sandy a gold key to the city, and he was given the freedom of the city of London. And Mayor Hayman said to Sandy, is there anything else that we could give you? And Sandy said, I'd like the school children to have a half day off.
Before his professional golfing career ended, Somerville won 12 more titles and would play as a semi-finalist in the 1938 British Amateur. For his accomplishments, Somerville would be honored as the Canadian golfer for the first half of the 20th century. Londoners who couldn't afford to tour with Somerville could use one of the new paved highways to Port Stanley. During the 1930s, the Lake Erie Resort was touted as the Coney Island of Western Ontario, attracting 2 million visitors a year. Dance palaces like the Casino and the Pavilion attracted the bands of Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and Woody Herman. Guy Lombardo, who fronted the top sweet band in America, counted trumpeter Louis Armstrong as one of his biggest fans. You can't find another band that can play a straight lead and make it sound that good, Armstrong tells his friends. But the most famous visitors of all came in June of 1939. King George and Queen Elizabeth arrived in London as part of their North American tour. It was the first visit by a reigning monarch in the city's history, and it all flew by in less than an hour. Members of a local motorcycle club had eagerly joined the militia so they could serve as escorts for the royal couple. One of them was Ralph Yull, who had just married.
We were so much more closely involved with, I say we, but I think Canadians generally felt more closely attached to Britain. I mean, we were British. Our passports were British passports at that time.
3 months later, Germany invaded Poland. Britain's declaration of war was heard over shortwave radio in London homes just after 5 o'clock Sunday morning. Ministers across the city announced the news at that morning's worship.
God has never promised us that we should be without tribulation, but He does promise us a victory over tribulation. There is no other way to peace. no matter how horrible may be the pathway we shall go through, God reigns and will use the horror to his ultimate glory. Reverend Quinton Warner.
Ralph Yull, as a member of the militia, was immediately asked to volunteer into the service. He went overseas that November. For 6 years, he would be absent from his wife and a son who arrived 8 months after his departure.
He actually wrote, in the first few months he was over there, wrote and told me that he'd met a girl over there that he was seeing, and the obvious inference was he was seeing and sleeping with. But I just thought, hey, a young man who's away for a long time is going to be a lot more normal young man when he comes home if he is seeing somebody and sleeping with them.
London had to catch up fast. Most of the uniforms and equipment were left over from World War I. Early training exercises at the Western Fairgrounds included outdated trench digging. Even the 1st Hussars maintained their cavalry unit for a brief time before becoming an armored unit. They would eventually help liberate France while the city's Royal Canadian Regiment distinguished itself in Italy. By 1945, 30,000 men had been recruited from London's military District No. 1. But you didn't have to wear a uniform to fight the war. The volunteer troop show became a way of entertaining soldiers in training camps around London. Cast members boosted morale at night while holding down a job during the day.
Monday and Wednesday and Thursday, I was out leading 3 different troop shows and getting home at 2 o'clock in the morning because the officers loved the girls so well that we always had to go back to the officers' mess for a while. And then we'd get home, and on Saturday and Friday, when I would get up and go to teach it to Adam Beck to lead it, I wasn't as enthusiastic about Latin as I had been on Monday. Anyway, that happened for the whole length of the war.
The Depression came to an end in a rush of employment. Anybody could be a war worker. Female students at Beale Technical School were taught how to operate drill presses and milling machines. London manufacturers quickly retooled for war materials. Spartan Electronic turned out submarine detectors that were so top secret most employees didn't know what they were working on. Financing the war effort became a patriotic necessity. Sandy Somerville, who served as a major overseas, encouraged London soldiers to send their pay back home to buy victory bonds. Hollywood actor Hume Cronin returned to his hometown to kickstart another bond campaign. During one grueling loan drive, Londoners were encouraged to gut their savings accounts. The city eventually raised $800,000, or $10 per citizen.
After a movie, you saw a newsreel, and it was usually of the Canadians doing something, and Ralph's mother and father, they had a habit of going, I think, Wednesday afternoons to the movies. And they were sitting in the movie theater, and the newsreel came on, and motorcyclists were riding. Ralph was training motorcyclists, and they came riding up over a hill towards the camera.
In a new kind of competition, there was riding for skill, where points were given for control.
And Ralph's dad stood up in the show, in the theater, and said, "That's my boy!" I've never forgotten that. And of course, everybody in the family went to see that film.
May 9th, 1945. Conventional sedateness, which so characterizes this Western Ontario city, quickly gave way to jubilant merrymaking Monday as residents, reassured by press reports of victory in Europe, exemplified their joy and thanksgiving in the largest unplanned celebration ever held here. Windsor Daily Star.
He came home, and I was really very, very happy to have him home. But I think that he felt that, hey, I did tell her that I was sleeping with somebody else. Maybe she'll feel kind of, and I can remember, we waited till my mother and sisters had gone to bed, because of course we were staying in that house, and he said, you know, if this is embarrassing for you, I could go and stay in the hotel tonight. And I said, no way! He'd just come home. I wanted him there.
One month after Germany's surrender, Ambrose Small's Grand Opera House was sold to the London Little Theatre for $35,000. Famous players had turned down a higher bid from a bowling alley operator. The financial sacrifice paved the way for one of the most vibrant theatrical visions in the city's history, and it was all done with local talent.
London really was a theater town. Right back to the founding of London, there were theatricals going on. And there was a large bunch of London Little Theatre people who had been sort of waiting in the wings for this purchase of the theater, and as soon as it happened, it went sky high. In fact, for many, many years, the London Little Theatre was called the largest little theatre in the world.
Here is Mary Ashwell speaking from CFPL in London.
London today became the hub of a far-flung circle of amateur thespians as the nationwide Dominion Drama Festival opened tonight at the Grand Theatre, the home of the London Little Theatre, host to this year's festival.
You know,
amateurs,
there are lots of amateur golfers that are really just as good as the professionals, but they don't earn their living at it. And it's the same with amateur players. We don't earn our living at it, and yet we may be quite good.
In the years before television, the London Little Theatre flourished. No production was too ambitious, no play too controversial. 1 out of every 10 households in London had a subscription. It was the only way to guarantee seats for most plays. The group attracted such devotion from its volunteers that one actor once cut his honeymoon short so he could attend rehearsals.
Every production that the London Little Theatre was done as intelligently and as expertly as I can ever imagine. The sets, the costumes. Do you know that there was a wardrobe department there that had hundreds and hundreds of costumes in it? There was a scene shop like you would see in New York.
It was everything to me. When I think back to those times, it was my sanctuary, it was my refuge. I was so grateful to be able to walk in those doors. I always felt safe and protected there. I felt like I belonged there. Because I was an odd kid, you know, I just wasn't an ordinary kid. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't had the Grand, honestly.
From London, Ontario, CBC Dominion has brought you a program of immortal music created by the Don Wright Chorus. The program originating in the studios of CFPL Radio and produced by Lillian Wright.
Television can never take the place of radio. It can only add to radio entertainment. One of its drawbacks is that television requires the viewer's full attention. You cannot read or do housework and watch the television screen at the same time. J. Frank Geary, Philco Television Distributor.
In the early 50s, no one in Canada could have guessed that London, Ontario would be on the cutting edge of telecommunications in a matter of years. The first television signals had started drifting across the city from American stations in the late 1940s. Several businessmen had built the nation's first cable systems to attract subscribers and sell television sets. Despite their efforts, the new technology remained a curiosity for most Londoners. On the evening of November 28, 1953, it became an obsession.
We are known as CFPL TV in London, Ontario. This is the city we serve.
CFPL TV was only the second private station to go on the air in Canada. It was the vision of Walter Blackburn, the first Canadian to own newspaper, radio, and television interests. But not even Blackburn could predict the impact of his modest little station. The arrival of CFPL single-handedly turned London into a community of television viewers.
I guess the highlight was, after all the ceremony, I found out there was a fire at the Dutch Laundry. And off went our news people, did the first news shot, took it back to the studio, developed it, had it on the 11 o'clock news. That was a great evening.
Within 10 years, the demand for new television programming would be bottomless. The crude cable systems of 1952 would mushroom into a major Canadian industry. Ed Jarmain, who entered the fledgling business as a hobby, sold his lucrative dry cleaning business and made cable his full-time job.
Without cable, you would probably be able to get passable reception. You wouldn't tolerate it today, but passable reception, maybe 30 or 40% of the time. Well, now, of course, you know, if you want to sit down for an evening of television, that's not exactly very satisfying.
Television and cable changed the way London and eventually the rest of Canada were entertained. Families no longer had to go outside of their living rooms for an evening's entertainment. Professional touring companies stopped coming to the Grand, forcing the London Little Theatre to strengthen its community productions. The London-based Don Wright Chorus, which enjoyed great success on Canadian and American airwaves, disbanded in 1956 when network radio collapsed. Movie chains began slashing promotional budgets and closing neighborhood theaters.
People go, well, we'll buy a television set, but we'll have to take the money that was spent on the movies to pay off the television set every week, and that's just what happened. Only the people that are selling televisions, they're all right.
But in those early years, CFPL engineers weren't really concerned about the consequences of TV. They were too busy learning what to put on air. The 1953 municipal campaign was the first to be televised and the first to see a woman elected to city council.
And there's Monsignor, Johnny Metris in front of his Mustangs. John Gervin, the quarter, fakes once, pitches out to Don Getty, who sweeps around the right side of his own line and goes for a first down.
The non-stop victories of the Western Mustangs kept sports fans riveted to their sets. Under the leadership of Johnny the Bull Metris, the team won 9 league championships in a 14-year period. Slippery the Sea Lion's escape from Storybook Gardens and his capture in Ohio made newscasts around the world and brought more crowds to London's newest tourist attraction than the best-planned publicity campaign. And if the coverage was stiff and formal, it didn't matter. Any image fascinated viewers. Even local newscasters didn't take themselves too seriously.
Do you find that the downtown core area is difficult to get around in? It's not bad this morning if I hurry. I see. Do you find facilities to your liking? Is there enough service around this part of the city? It's good right now if I hurry. I mean, I can make it at all planned. Did you find that there are enough facilities to suit your business down here? Yeah, it was great. It was great. It was great. No! Here! Come back!
Like the 1930s, the decade ended with a royal tour. This time, Londoners didn't have to wait on sidewalks to get a close look at Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Television was there to do it for them.
I didn't know that protocol prohibited media from talking to the royalty, you know, and when they were busy talking with people, you had to stay back. The media had to stay well out of the way. And I asked my assistant to get up there between the wheelchairs and get this microphone in here and pick up some of this casual conversation. I had never seen it before. I'd never heard of it being done before. But I thought, why can't we be the first ones? And he kept looking at this microphone a couple of times, and then finally he says, if you don't get that microphone out of here, I'm apt to say something very rude.
The city's attitude towards its British roots would change during the next decade. For the first time in its history, London would escape the shadow of its English namesake and create its own voice in North America. And it all started with a student who had flunked out of the Ontario College of Art.
What about this piece with all the nose on it? Were you trying to kid anybody with that?
No, maybe I was. It's hard to say. There it is. What are you going to say about it? Some people will think I was kidding them, some people won't. As it was, I just wrote no on a painting I was doing, and the no speaks, and it comes out and it says it. You can't be more explicit than that.
Most of London's establishment didn't understand Greg Curno's work. Those who did hated it. including the director of the Public Art Gallery, who was openly horrified with one exhibition. But the younger crowd felt the 25-year-old brought a fresh approach to the art community, and unlike earlier London artists, Curnow's talent was entirely homegrown. Inspired by the teachers at H.B. Beale's art program, Curnow decided to work out of his own community.
Jack Chambers dropped by, I believe within about the first year of Greg making that decision, and he was just back from Spain, where he had married and done some training, was thinking about going back to Spain, until he dropped by Greg's place and saw this one artist saying, damn it, I'm going to stay here. There's no way, there isn't enough in the ground from which we take our nourishment, the place where we happen to have all these relatives, that, this place is meaningful for me, and I know that if I look deeply enough and hard enough, this will be enough to sustain a career. So the whole explosion of the arts that began in the early 60s, the absolute linchpin in that whole thing was Greg Curnow, but it was Curnow and then ultimately about 24 other people all coming to the same decision. We will go down the 401 to Toronto no more.
People said in Toronto, gee, you've got Greg Curnow to design one of your shows. He's designed a puppet show for you. Chambers has designed a theater, and so on, and for you and all that. We can't get anybody to help us at all down in Toronto. And Keith General said, well, it's because it's so blah here, you have to do something.
Curnow cultivated everything: films, plays, art magazines, galleries, and music. He was also determined to promote the work of his fellow artists. He once turned down an offer from the Art Gallery of Ontario to stage his own exhibition, preferring to share the spotlight with his colleagues.
Greg wanted to see a scene here. He wanted to see things happen. And he did not want to be the leader of everything.
If there was a couple of young artists who might start painting like Greg, he got quite annoyed about that sort of thing, because they weren't doing their own thing. They were reading art magazines and not working out of their own experience.
I just want to keep it the way it is, where my painting is integrated with everything else I do, where I feel genuine about it. As long as I feel the work is genuine, I think that there are going to be similarities between paintings.
I think the thing about him was that he somehow was completely normal and sweet and communal and friendly, and yet still an artist, instead of being bitchy and selfish and mean the way some of them are, with a swarm of discarded girlfriends and a couple of suicides, the Andy Warhol thing. That sort of thing just never appealed to Greg. His things were always community, having fun together, and unconsciously being a role model for kids.
By the early 1960s, suburbia had arrived. Farmers' fields that had once provided food for the city were now plowed under and paved for housing developments, shopping plazas, and supermarkets. Bellwood Park was among the first new housing developments in post-war London. It soon had company: White Oaks and Glencairn Woods to the south, Westmount and Oakridge to the west, Argyle and Nelson Park to the east, Masonville and Stony Brook to the north. The opening of Highway 401 in 1957 began to shift growth away from the city's core. The arrival of supermalls accelerated downtown London's decline by creating self-contained commercial communities. City Hall saw the winds of progress, did the inevitable. On New Year's Day, 1961, London witnessed a mammoth land annexation that took in the university and the village of Byron. The city's population jumped overnight by 50%, while its land area increased from 11 square miles to 62. It was open season for construction.
It used to be that we were surrounded by cornfields, and they would gather the corn in the middle of the night frequently. And I still, sometimes, I'm up in the night, I look out and I will see a light, and I will think first, oh, they're gathering corn. And then I realized it's a street night.
By the late 1960s, it was impossible to keep up with development. The local Board of Education had built 8 new high schools and 22 public schools. The Ontario Vocational Centre was expanded into Fanshawe College. The University of Western Ontario evicted the Hunt Club golf course from its property because the land was needed for a $30 million expansion program. Through it all, suburbia kept flowing towards the city's new boundaries.
London is a beautiful city, and the growth of any worthwhile home development must offer the same good taste, convenient services, and room for future growth of the individual, family, or community. We are well aware that this prestige is the result of sound planning that contributes to the solidarity of Greater London. Herb J. McClure, President of McClure Construction Limited.
In a sign of the times, McClure would serve out 2 terms as mayor. His successor wasn't as lucky. In February of 1972, Fred Gosnell, mayor for less than 2 months, suffered a heart seizure and resigned. The next month, one disbelieving Toronto paper reported that a James Bigelow had been elected to London's top job.
When we were approaching a door going into a meeting, I stepped forward in a hurry and opened the door and held it for Mayor Bigelow, and she turned and said in what I thought was a rather disapproving term, "You don't have to do that for me." And my reply was, if I didn't do it, Mayor Bigelow, my mother would turn over in her grave.
Denied a law degree by her family, Jane Bigelow had studied gymnastics, folk dancing, and community planning. First elected to City Council in 1969, she had also served as president of the local NDP Association. She would have been an unusual choice for mayor in any Canadian city, but her arrival was a shockwave to staid old London.
Men in those days weren't used to having a woman who was a boss, as it were, or had a position that was perhaps a little higher than theirs. And that I felt all the time when I was on council, that undercurrent. It was always there. So I think that was part of it too. The world was changing and people weren't able to keep up quite as fast as maybe they should.
She had the ability to work with people and to bring out the best in the people that were around her. And as I say, she put aside her basic political philosophy so as to apply objectivity, which to me is a very important and a not too often possessed characteristic of people in leadership roles.
As only the second female mayor of a major Canadian city, Bigelow brought a radical new vision to London. She fought for accessible daycare, shelters for battered women, funding for the arts, and better city planning. Unlike the mayors before her, Bigelow was cool to new development, arguing the city was big enough already.
Developers are always seen as being bad guys, which is unfair, frankly, because London has had nothing but very good developers, with few exceptions. But they got themselves into a bad reputation, so it was a chance for people to say, slow it down, stop it, let's take a breather, see where we're going.
Londoners were fascinated by a mayor who rode a bicycle to official events and who refused to wear a hat in the presence of Queen Elizabeth. Her support of the local arts community and cultural events like the Home County Folk Festival also won her a legion of voters who kept her in office for 6 unpretentious years.
We used to hold this stupid little thing called the Spring Festival in the Croxton Common every year. We were absolutely just stunned come the morning of the Spring Festival when this car turns up and the mayor gets out. And we didn't know what to do with her that first year. She ran the egg and spoon race, as I recall, and did okay, but she didn't exactly distinguish herself. The next year, though, we knew she was coming, so we went to incredible lengths and constructed a life-size board for a game of chess. And of course, we let her be the White Queen. We had a special crown made for her, which of course she put on in her role as the White Queen. And I think it had been maybe that year, maybe the year before, that Queen Elizabeth had come to London, and great frou-for-all was raised because the mayor would not wear a hat to greet the Queen, and I guess this was just the way it was done in terms of the big protocol. But she had no problem wearing a hat as long as she could be the Queen.
In 1976, Bigelow fell in with the supporters of a new art gallery and museum. the dual-purpose building would be constructed at the Forks of the Thames on the site of Simcoe's original visit. The project would be Bigelow's most lasting legacy to the artistic community she adored. It would also be one of her biggest political mistakes.
And they got Raymond Moriyama to design this blessed thing. It was seen as a bit of a grab by the rank and file, blue-collar workers, people like myself. We didn't particularly we liked the idea of an art gallery. We didn't like what happened. She sided with the establishment, and that was shocking. And I think it was perhaps the one singular point that cut down a lot of her support.
2 years later, London voters rejected Bigelow in favor of Al Gleason, a former Western Mustang who confessed he rarely attended cultural events.
There was a gang on council who wanted to take me out of there, and they succeeded. I know that there was at least one meeting of council members where they worked at drafting a member of council to run, and I guess they succeeded in getting Al Gleason to run. And what was behind all of that, I'm not entirely sure. But I think it had a lot to do perhaps with the development industry and perhaps the business community.
The city had to get moving. It had to come out of the slumber time, Sleepy Hollow village atmosphere. Either take it and be that and just go down slowly, or catch the wave, so to speak.
In a 1980 broadcast of television's All in the Family, the character of Archie Bunker quipped, "Who the hell ever heard of London, Ontario?" 2 years later, most of the world had.
I'd just like to thank everybody for coming here, for making this day so special for me. I was so excited about coming home because there's nothing like home. Your home means your family and your friends.
Karen Baldwin was the only Canadian and the only Londoner to win the title Miss Universe. The former sales clerk symbolized the new face of London over the next 10 years. It was no longer enough for the city to excel on its own terms. It had to reach for glamorous, world-class status. While 1980s development didn't have the civic boosterism of the 1960s, it compensated by sheer size. Towers of tinted glass and steel rose from the skyline, dwarfing the Dominion Public Building, the city's tallest structure for 40 years. Convention centers and road expansions became the municipal construction of choice. In the suburbs, the real estate boom rolled over farmland, prompting another annexation that swallowed the village of Lambeth and most of Westminster Township. London now had a larger population than the nation's capital. The city's medical reputation grew during the 1980s. Victoria Hospital expanded while University Hospital became renowned for its work on immunology, sports medicine, and heart research. London's 3 supermalls went on a renovation and enlargement spree in a battle to prove who was the biggest and the best. Parking at White Oaks became so cramped, the mall's owners were forced to tear down a building just for extra space. Even the downtown area received its own 2-block shopping center in an attempt to lure customers back to the core. The growth obscured the alarming fact that many of the city's corporations ceased to be locally owned. For the first time in its history, London's economic future was not controlled by Londoners. Author Orlo Miller had spent most of his life giving London's history a voice. He now stood on the sidelines, watching much of his vision fall to progress. In 1988, he published his final book, This Was London. Ironically, it was titled after a romantic play he had written during London's centennial 4 decades earlier.
The face of London has changed, almost beyond recognition. Buildings that have benignly observed the passing scene for 50, 75, or 100 years are being gobbled up by the developers' bulldozers, or starched, prettified, and gentrified like aging harlots. A kind of unstructured frenzy has seized upon the business community. None of them seem to know where they're going. That's probably because they don't know where they've been. We are in danger of becoming alienated, not only from our past, but from one another. It has been discovered that high-rise apartment buildings do not breed neighborhoods. Quite the contrary. Walls separate people more than lawns. London, Canada, is a proud city. It has been a beautiful city. Its pride and its beauty can be secured and maintained only by constant, unremitting vigilance. Orlo Miller.
I was sued by Ontario Hydro. That lawsuit was abandoned. I was illegally removed from the London Hydro Commission by the London City Council. That decision was challenged in court and was overturned. A lover whose advances I finally rejected complained of criminal misconduct to the anti-racket squad of the Ontario Provincial Police and to the London
I think
Police
I was
Department.
just
Both
coming back
police
from a London Hydro meeting. We'd had a real controversy erupt early December of 1996, and I'd been covering a lot of the daily nonsense that was going on there. There was a major controversy about the new president they just hired, and a couple of commissioners weren't getting along with him, and all these allegations about private detectives and who was tailing whom and all this sort of ugliness, and it was becoming a real, it was painting a picture that was sort of not that good of Hydro and quite frankly of London. Anyway, I think it was coming back from one of those meetings or at the meeting, I can't remember, but I got word that we were one of the 3 finalists for the Summer Games.
The Canada Summer Games were the biggest multi-sporting event in the nation. London, after being rejected for 2 earlier tournaments, had made the short list with 2 tourism capitals, Ottawa Carleton and the Niagara region. While the city came up short on its sporting facilities, London's ace was its community spirit. In late April, the bid selection committee started its tour of all 3 cities to select the winner. London was 3rd on the list.
I have to tell you that I was very nervous when I went to bed that night, didn't get a lot of sleep, and all through the night, all I could do was hear this wind howling. And it just, you know, I had visions of like snow and hail coming down. And when I finally woke up that morning, we knew that it was not going to be the best day, and I think there was at least probably one moment where I wanted to go back to bed.
By the time the committee's bus reached London, it was pouring. Despite the weather, Londoners stood by the roads, cheering the motorcade as it passed.
It was like really rainy and yucky. We were yelling at the windows at everybody on the street. It was fun. I was screaming, I lost my voice.
It was just phenomenal. Everywhere they turned, there were just hundreds and hundreds of people lining streets and wrapped in plastic bags with their little Canadian flags, and you know, kids had been making posters and signs, and you know, the weather's just, rain's just dripping on them and all the paint's coming off.
They brought the site selection people in a bus, a tour bus, and there's an elevator in the convention center, and they brought it up, and they opened the doors of the bus and then trotted the people directly into the hall, and the people were just in a frenzy. It was great. It was the best rally I've ever seen, bar none. And the wall of sound was greeting these people, and the selection team walked in, and their jaws were open and their eyes were like this, and they just couldn't believe what they were seeing.
We came, you conquered. We know you do.
It's just one of those feelings that you never forget. It's really hard to describe in words, but you just never forget it. It's like the best moment of my life. I can't describe it even. It's just an amazing feeling. It really was.
A month later, the 2001 Summer Games were awarded to London.
There's Buckminster Fuller on stage at South Secondary School, and I think he'd done kind of a quick study of London. And he said, you know what occurs to me about you folks is you are so kind of stuck here between Toronto and Detroit. You've got these kind of two major cultural centers there and there, but you're a good distance away from both of them. In effect, you are too far to drive and you're too close to fly. And the implications of this are that this will leave you to your own devices. You're far enough away that you're not going to be absolutely crushed by what they're doing. You're not going to be kind of so caught up in their scenes that you won't bother to cultivate one of your own. And this is probably the ideal sort of geographical situation you could ask for.
Within the first decade of the new millennium, London's population will reach 400,000, twice what it was in 1965, 10 times what it was in 1900, and 200 times what it was in 1840. In many ways, this growth has improved on the city's past. Despite massive development, Londoners are more protective of their environment than ever. Recent construction of bike paths along the Thames River took place on land that was once earmarked for a high-speed expressway. After decades of neglect, the Thames River is cleaner today than it was 50 years ago. After 2 decades of focusing on suburban growth, civic leaders are more concerned than ever about reviving downtown London. 44 years after electing the first woman councillor, Londoners sent women to the top 2 jobs at City Hall. Despite the domination of Toronto in provincial politics, 2 London men have sat in the Premier's chair since 1961. Events like Panorama continue to broaden the city's cultural mix in ways that Victoria Day picnics never did. London, the 10th largest city in Canada, is still a small town at heart, a fact that has always appealed to its citizens, old and new. Shortly before his death in 1977, Guy Lombardo was asked if he would ever retire from the band business and move back to London. "No, I honestly can't say that I would," said Lombardo, "but I'd always be happy to visit for the memories."
Ladies and gentlemen, Her Worship Diane Haskett.
In the words of the English poet William Blake, what now is was once only imagined. This announcement today teaches us all in the London region not to be afraid to dream and not to be afraid to pursue our dreams. The motto of London is work and perseverance. If we work hard and persevere, and Providence shines down on us, there is nothing we cannot achieve together. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.